Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. We're glad that y'all could join us today. For those of y'all who are here in the auditorium, we just ask that you please mute your cell phones. For those of y'all on Zoom, please mute your microphones and use the chat for your questions. We'll have a Q&A session for everyone at the end of the lecture. After the lecture, be sure to check out our Summer Fun Day about archaeology, which we have all around the first floor. We have lots of hands-on activities for all those who are young and old at heart. You can check those out. The program ends at 2. Also, a reminder that the next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, July 3rd at noon, featuring Andrew Dubstead. He is the Education and Interpretation Supervisor for the North Carolina Division of State Historic Sites. So he will examine the hard luck career of the CSS Noose and its crew during the Civil War and beyond. So we hope that y'all can join us for his presentation on July 3rd. Now today, we welcome author James D. Charlet, who will provide a brief insight into his newest book, Shipwreck: Rescues of the Outer Banks, Sensational Wrecks and Heroic Rescues by the United States Life-Saving Service. So his book is available for sale in the museum shop, and there will be a book signing after the lecture out in the hallway at the little red table. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Charlet. Thank you.
Well, as another good old Southern boy said, thank you very much. I am going to talk about that book, but before that, both of these books are about the United States Life-Saving Service. So I want to speak very briefly about that. Very briefly. The United States Life-Saving Service is one of the least known, yet most inspirational aspects in all of American history. The biggest author of the life-saving service nationwide is Ralph Shanks. He wrote a great book that's now out of print. But I have memorized his first opening paragraph. It says so much. Quote, "They were the greatest heroes of the American coast, routinely risking their lives in the grand maritime rescues. Their work was respected and honored by America's most prestigious leaders, celebrated in the most popular publications of their day, and of deep interest to medical, educational, political, and religious leaders. The Wright brothers knew them well. The poet Walt Whitman wrote of them, and the artist Winslow Homer painted them. But somehow America forgot these peaceful heroes." Now, Shanks goes on with the rest of that paragraph, but I always like to stop there because that's our theme. America's forgotten heroes. Somehow America forgot these heroes. Very briefly, the service existed on all of America's coasts, all 4, and sometimes we forget about the 4th one, that's the Great Lakes, from 1871 until 1915. In that year, the Life-Saving Service, which had the singular mission of land-based ocean rescue, merged with the United States Revenue Cutter Service, which had the singular mission of ocean-based law enforcement, to form today's, hoorah! That's right, Coast Guard. At that point, the Coast Guard now had 2 missions. Today, they have 11. And we won't go into that. But you ask any coastie today why he or she joined, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, to save lives. And that was the sole purpose of the Life-Saving Service. So without going into too many more details, a lot of those will be answered as we go on. My first book is the one on the blue cover. And that book was released worldwide in March of 2020. Does that ring any bells? Yeah, there was something else released worldwide in March of 2020. So that was COVID, of course. And that put me and our publisher on hold for about 2 years. Well, I'm kind of a homebody. And so I guess the silver lining to me for COVID was I could write another book. So I stayed at home and I wrote this one. But by the time that was finished, we still hadn't really promoted book 1, so we're doing that. Today, I want to talk about both of those books, but mostly to let you know and answer any questions. Often I get asked, how long does it take to write a book and how do you do it and all that? And basically, my answer is the first book I wrote 90% of it just from the top of my head because I had worked at a life-saving service museum for 10 years and I knew a lot of that stuff. And the reason I stopped doing that and wrote this book instead was that place had one great story. And I told that story hundreds of times. But the more I read, the more I found out there were thousands of these stories. They were unbelievable. And then when I found out most of America had never heard of them, I couldn't believe it. So my mission immediately began to do this. So I want to give you a little some idea about what's in these books. I'm going to start with one in volume 1, which is the blue book. And I'm going to start this story at the end, and there's a reason for that. It's chapter 11 in volume 1. It's called the Ephraim Williams. That's the name of the vessel. Without going into how that happened, it was a long, dragged-out story. That vessel was bouncing around from one place to the next, and the lifesavers were all. We had 29 stations, by the way, on all the North Carolina coast, and we have the beaches covered 24/7. Every station had a watchtower, which means from sunrise to sunset, you can see what's going on. You can see the next station 6 miles on either direction. So that's all covered. At night or on days with poor visibility, you had beach patrol where you actually go out with a lantern and walk the beach. And so if a shipwreck occurs, the service knew about it within minutes. It may take him hours to get there. So anyway, for the Ephraim Williams, this was bouncing along and 4 or 5 stations were involved. Finally, it lands somewhere and the station goes out to get them. One of the most amazing parts of that story is witnesses on the beach watch the surf boat. Now, the surf boat is the little oar-powered thing you see on the blue cover. The men called it Armstrong engines. But the witnesses on the beach said they could see the boots of the men in the boat. That means it's going like this over the waves. They had to go out 5 miles. Came back, everybody was safe. That was the end of the story. But the reason I included that is because every time there was a major wreck on the coast, the service would send out a supervisor to write a more detailed report. Those were always in-house. They weren't meant to be public. But this one went public soon. And you can see why, because I'm going to read that word for word. We never did find out the name of the supervisor, but I would like to quote it. He says, "I do not believe that a greater act of heroism is recorded than that of Daly," that's Keeper Daly, "and his crew on this momentous occasion. These poor, plain men, dwellers upon the lonely sands of Hatteras, took their lives in their hands and, at the most imminent risk, crossed the most tumultuous sea that any boat within the memory of living men had ever attempted on that bleak coast, and all for what? So that others might live." Today, the Coast Guard proudly continues to use that phrase, so others may. If you ask any coastie, what is your main function? I'm here so others may live. So that's why I included that. Very briefly, 2 stories that are 2 of my favorites in that book, and you're hearing just the tip of the iceberg. The Aaron Ripard was a small, medium-sized schooner that got caught in the worst hurricane that had ever hit North America at that time. It was August of 1899. The captain of the Aaron Ripard, and all of the stations knew this was coming. So they're all out on the beach waiting for wrecks to happen. So the captain of the Aaron Ripard, for some reason, decided, I think I'll do the second worst thing you can do in a hurricane. I think I'll anchor here. Well, what that means is now you're a target. If the waves hit you and you're moving around, that's one thing. But if you're stationary, it's going to start splintering that boat in no time. And that's what he did. And he's too far away for the Lyle gun to reach. The surf is too heavy for the surf boats. So the surfmen are sitting on the beach just watching, knowing what's going to happen. At that point, he decides maybe I could do the worst possible thing you can do in a hurricane. He dropped anchor. I mean, he already did that. He set up the sails. That means you're going to wreck faster than you were before. So as they finally get close enough, the service guys are watching these sailors jump off into this oblivion, and they don't come back up. Finally, there's 3 of them left, and there's 3 stations there. So each station has like 6 or 8 guys. So there's a lot of people, a lot of equipment. 3 of them say, we can't stand this anymore. We got to do something. The book doesn't cover this. So three guys volunteered to have ropes, heavy ropes tied around them. You guys anchor behind me. We're going to go out, and if we need your help, you pull us back in. One of the first people to go in was 70-year-old keeper Hooper from the Kennebec station. Immediately, when he's in the surf, a huge piece of timber from the ship that has been split off hits his left leg and breaks it. What does he do? He continues on into the surf, gets another victim, and brings him back alive. And all 3 are done. That's the end of that story, but it's not the end of the storm. And so these 2 chapters are kind of related. The next, everybody knew that the storm is not over. Everybody knew that somebody's going to draw the night watch next after being exhausted all day long. And poor Rasmus Midget from the Gull Shoal station did draw that. So he's riding his personal horse. Remember, this is in the middle of the night, in the middle of a hurricane. As he's going down there, he passes one wreck after the next. Now, in my mind, when I was reading this story, I added something that's not factual, but what I wrote was, I'm sure Rasmus smiled as he felt the wind pounding him in the face. The reason I wrote that is I live on Hatteras Island, and I know when you walk the beach, you always go into the wind first, because on the way back, it's at your back. And Rasmus knew that too, so I'm sure he was smiling. And finally, he gets to another wreck, and he hears some screaming and whatnot. He goes, oh, this isn't new. This is what he realized is that this ship was the Priscilla. It was a fairly large vessel. It had broken in 2. 10 people were in the front part of it, which is called the what do you call the front part? No. Oh, thank you. Yeah, they were in the bow. And they're screaming because it's in the middle of the night. They're in the middle of a hurricane. They have no idea where they are. Rasmus quickly realized they're close enough for me to run out and get one at a time. He also realized this, the height of the wave, the higher the waves, the further apart they are. It's called wavelength. So these were huge waves, so there was a big space in between them. So he hollered out to the boat, to the vessel. He said, when I say jump, I want one of you to jump. I'm going to run out and get you and bring you back. And it worked. So he did that a second time, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh. At this point, Rasmus realized there's 3 more on the boat, on the vessel, too badly damaged for the injured for this to work. So the 8th time, he runs out, climbs up the ship, hauls one of them on his back, jumps down again between the waves and takes him to shore, and does that a 9th time, and does that a 10th time. Single-handedly, Rasmus Midget, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a hurricane, saved 10 people. But somehow, America forgot. So enough of volume 1. On to volume 2. The reason I wrote this book was the more I did research, the more story I kept finding, story after story after story. Most of them were beyond belief. In a lot of the chapters, I say things like, if this was a Hollywood movie, people wouldn't believe it. But these are real. And all of the stories are documented from official government documents. We know these things for a fact. And often when people ask me about writing a book, I tell them the research and the writing is the fun part. The editing is when it's work. And I'm in the middle of doing that right now for another book. This is called the chapter 27 in the Orange Book is the wreck and rescue of the schooner A.B. Goodman. And I want to read you an extensive excerpt from that, because when I wrote it, sometimes you can say things in writing that you just can't get out in verbal speech. And it also gives you a good idea of the writing in this book. And it's one of my favorite pieces. So bear with me as I read this. This is on page 251. In the beginning of this real life drama is unfathomable to modern minds. In almost Hollywood fashion, the men resigned themselves to the inevitable. They knew this day might come when they signed up to be lifesavers. They knew they might risk all and lose so that others may live. They knew that the odds were in their favor when the book said they had to go out, but it was eerily silent about coming back. Now it was very evident that the mighty surfmen were being placed in a position of being against all odds. But this is what they also knew. They knew that day the wind was blowing powerfully seaward away from the land. They knew their surf boat was a small, flat-bottomed craft that would be skipped over the water like a boy bouncing stones. They knew that being pushed out into that violent, rolling, massive sea with towering waves would give them almost no chance of returning. They knew all of this in their hearts and in their heads before entering the surf boat. And then in the book, say by name who they were, because I wanted people to hear those island names. Times were different then, our culture and our values were different then. Before launching the surf boat, the group gathered together in a calm, silent, foreboding resolution. They made a compact with the Almighty and prepared for the after. They each made out a simple short will. Then these real-life men, sworn and dedicated to duty and welfare of their fellow man, emptied their pockets of the few remaining possessions, a watch, a wallet, a few coins, perhaps a penknife, and gave them to one of the surfmen to keep back at the station for family and friends. Then they launched their surf boat into destiny. Then I go on to tell the story. Very briefly, this is what happened. The wreck is 2 miles offshore. The wind is hurricane speed. The waves are 10, 15 feet high. It's just an impossible surf. It takes they launched their surf boat. It takes them 2 hours to go the 2 miles. Now, when I was reading this story, I said to myself, there were 4 different times that the average person today would say, that's it. We're stopping. We can't make it. And so I call them the likely. So that was the first likely end. They finally get there. They can't get close enough to the boat to save anybody because their boat is going to smash into it. So in my mind, I can see somebody saying, "Guys, well, we tried, but we have to go back." They did not. They waited. They waited and they waited, and they said, "Well, let's try again." So they back off, and then they try a second time. What they want to do is get as close to the wreck as they can without the surf pushing them into it. But that didn't work, so they try a second time, they try a third time, they try a fourth time, and none of them worked. So they back off again. That would have been the second likely end, not these guys. So they wait a little bit longer. One more reading from the book. After 1 more hour and trying to reach these men that had wrecked at 6:30 the day before, Keeper Daly felt the seas had calmed somewhat enough to make a decisive attempt. He was about to employ a simple, time-tested, yet ingenious United States Life-Saving Service rescue method. What that was he got his surfman to paddle his surf boat downwind, upwind of the wreck, and then they anchored. What that means is, as they let 1 foot of anchor chain out, they're moving toward the wreck, but they're under control. So they can get within feet of it safely. And that's what they did. So they're maybe a yard away from the wreck. So they're still safe. And there's 5, there had been 1 sailor had already been lost. There's 4 left. So he motions to, come on and jump into the surf boat. the first guy gets ready to do that, and he looks down at that cauldron of sea and is terrified. He jumps back onto the wreck. Well, Captain Daly was aware of these things, so he just told the young man, just calm down, do take your time, we'll wait for you. So as he tries the second time, he's about to do it again, and what Captain Daly does is grab a hold of him and yank him into the surf. So the second guy does the same thing. Captain Daly yanks him into the surf. So the third and fourth guys go, that's all right, we'll jump. So they did. And that could have been the third likely ending. Now, in order to understand the fourth ending, you have to understand this much about the geography. This is at the dreaded Diamond Shoals off of Cape Hatteras. If you think of an oblong shape off of Cape Hatteras that goes out 20 miles and can be 4 or 5 miles wide, and it's those are sandbars. That's why these things wreck there. When they came from the south side of that, where their station was. They're now up here. Now the wind has shifted and they can't get back that way. So they're going to have to go all the way around the shoals. That puts them way off track. So by 2 o'clock that morning, they're coming into shore near the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Somehow or another, the keepers and assistant keepers of that lighthouse saw what was happening, helped them come to shore, and they even prepared a meal for them and for the crew and for the lifesavers. The lifesavers declined. They said, we don't want to be in the way. So what did they do? They now had to walk 5 miles back through the sandy soil, through the storm, through the darkness to their station. Did they get any medals for that? I thought surely they got, so I knew where to look for that. 4 gold medals were issued that year. None of them to these guys. Why? They were just doing their job. But somehow America forgot. So the last reading from volume 2 is this. That morning, when the surfmen launched their boat into destiny, they knew as always that if a shipwreck in their part of the graveyard of the Atlantic, the book said they had to go out, but said nothing about coming back. What they did not know in their valiant struggle was that it would be a monumental success against all odds. At this point, I am through telling stories, and what I'd like to do is just answer any questions that you might have. You're absolutely stunned. Yes, ma'am. The good question, what time period is it we're talking about? The life-saving service itself existed from 1871 till 1915. So it's about a 44-year period. And I'm glad you asked me that, because one of the things I love to say and sometimes forget, that if you don't remember anything I've said today except this, that I've done well. In the 44-year history of the life-saving service nationwide, these men responded to over 178,000 lives in peril, of which they saved over 177,000. But somehow America forgot. Does not make sense. That's why this is my mission. Any more great questions like that? Yes. Bearded one. And that's another great question. I often forget to say that. If you consider, and look at that little boat, that was the main means of rescue. And if you consider most of the time they're going through these violent storms to do that, their only piece of safety equipment was a cork life vest. That's it. In the 44-year history nationwide, over 44 years, their own loss of life, less than 1%. It just doesn't make sense. You can see why I'm passionate about this. I cannot believe that we have forgotten this history. And of course, that blends into my admiration for today's United States Coast Guard, which I also think does not get enough credit for what they do. So, hoorah, Coast Guard. Right here.
I know that I've been to the legislative station in Hatteras. And I know there's a museum in Intermanteo, but I don't like think it's open. I don't know when it's open, but what are the places around here where we can go and learn about some of the history of the
Boy, you have some great questions. Where can you go to find out more about this? The Graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras Village on Hatteras Island is probably the #1 place to learn about a lot of stuff. And it's a fun way to learn because their exhibits are interactive and they're very good. They cover the gamut. I consider it one of the finest maritime museums in the country. And if you ever have a chance to go that's where you can learn a lot. There's one, they start with a 6-minute film, and that 6-minute film, you know 90% of what I just said. They've done a very good job of that. There is on your way there in the village of Rodanthe, there is the Chickamaucomico Life Saving Station, and it's a very good exhibit. I was site manager there for 10 years, and that's where I started learning about all this stuff. And like everybody else in America, I'd never heard of that. I thought, what? And then when I found out more and more, it's like I just can't just sit here and tell one story. So that's a good place to go. And of course, reading these 2 books is another very good way to learn all about it. In book 1, I tell a lot of the basics a lot of the details that you need to know about the rest. In book 2, I just kind of make some references to that. I also want you to know that I just finished chapter 28 of book 3. And the working title of book 3 is the Early Coast Guard Rescues on the Outer Banks. So that goes from 1915, when it first became the Coast Guard, till 1940. And the reason I stopped there is I didn't want to go to 41. And you probably know why. That's a whole nother, just too much stuff. But what's some highlights that you can get out of that is that covers, of course, 1915. 2 years later, we were involved in World War I. So there's some stories about the German submarines and whatnot in there. And then not too many years after that is the beginning of I can never remember the name of the act, but we typically call it Prohibition. So there are about 4 different chapters about the Coast Guard being involved in Prohibition. And one of the funnier ones was, I'm not going to tell this story, but a little bit about it, was a schooner from Canada called, this was the name of the schooner, I'm Alone. I am alone. I'm alone. And it became the most famous rum runner. And there was an incident where a Coast Guard vessel saw it and chased it, and they started firing vegetables at each other. And then they started firing guns at each other. And a capture was made, and some people were killed, and it almost caused an international incident. Canada was furious. You can't be doing this to our boat. So it was not a good story for us, but it's in the book. Any more questions? Yes, right here.
Weapons from the military forces back then, were they almost the exact same for the ones that are here now?
You saying, are you asking the weapons back then the same as now? No, there's been considerable developments on all fronts, both the boats and the training and the equipment. Yes, significant development. Yes, yes.
Got in trouble. How did they communicate?
That is another great question. The only communications available during that whole period, 1871 to 1915, would have been signal flags. And you see these displayed as just displays now, but each of those, it's a very complicated language. And each of those flags had multiple meanings. The flag itself, if you just looked at it, could, and you had to memorize all this stuff, could mean, I'm in trouble, would you please send help? It could also be used just to mean one letter where they could spell out like in Morse code. But that was the only communication they had. Now, if you look at some of the pictures of the early stations, you'll see these huge towers. And it's natural for us to automatically think that that's a radio tower. No, it was a signal flag tower. That's how we communicated with them. Good questions. Yes.
Transition between the modern Coast Guard versus the life-saving station.
That is chapter 1 in volume 3. That's exactly where I started. And I was editing that just last week. And the short answer to your question is the things pretty well stayed the way they were before. Just the name had changed. The nomenclature also changed. The Coast Guard felt like they wanted to be more water-based and remembered that. And if you look at the Coast Guard logo, you see the date 1790. The life-saving service started in 1871. So you say, why is it 1790? That's the Revenue Cutter Service. So they thought of themselves more of that. And if you think about it, I can understand why. The Revenue Cutter Service in 1790 was the only military service the United States had. There was no Army, no Navy. That was it, the Revenue Cutter Service. So what happened is the stations pretty well, the land-based stations stayed pretty much themselves. And if you think about it, and I do talk about this in chapter 1, these were always in little remote communities. So these people knew everybody in the village. They helped them out. They served them ice cream. They did all that kind of stuff. The Revenue Cutter Service were based in large city ports, and they had very little contact with it. So there was a big difference in it took a while for them to become more unified. But the rest is in chapter 1. What a wonderful group of people. God bless you all. Yes, another question.
You were talking about going to a museum, the chief of a commentary, like he explained. Yeah. You guys, like, how many days a week or a month do you guys do the whole presentation? Shooting out
right. It's called the beach apparatus drill with the Lyle gun. I'm not there anymore. I quit in 2015, and so I can do this. But they do that June, July, and August every Thursday. That's it and it's about a 20-minute program, and it's a great show. Yeah.
My question is definitely not as intriguing, but the movie The Finest Hour.
Yes.
Right. Did you have any contact with those people that wrote the movie or producers or whatever? Because you seem like you have plethora.
I'm trying to get their attention right now, yes, because these are certainly movie worth. But what's interesting about that was the Pendleton and the Cape. Can't remember the name of the station to come on. This happens a lot. Anyway, when you see the Lao gun procedure where they fire a line to a ship, you think, and they're taking one person off at a time, you think, well, they certainly have improved that over the years, and they did. But the lifesaving service was so efficient, and so the later Coast Guard was so efficient with doing that the last Lao gun rescue was made by that station in 1964. Chatham Station is correct. Thank you. Yes, ma'am, right here in front.
Life-saving station service.
Another great question. One of the chapters, I forget which book now, I talk about when these guys signed up. They were given no guarantee. They were barely paid. They had to pay for their own food. They had to pay for their own uniforms. They had to pay for their own housing. They could be transferred at any time. They could be dismissed at any time. And I list a whole bunch of things like that. And then I say, and now for the bad news. And there was bad news. And so to answer your question, the good news was finally, that's one of the main reasons the Coast Guard was created in 1915, because these people had no benefits whatsoever. So all of that was addressed in 1915. But to answer your question more specifically, I think the first payments in 1871 were $40 a month. And again, that's in those dollars, which would be more today, but still, it wasn't much. And again, you could be dismissed for any reason at any time. And you didn't have to be paid. It was all up to the keeper was kind of God back in those days. Speaking of which, I'm portrayed as Keeper James, and people automatically assume I'm dealing with lighthouses. So let me clarify that. Everybody knows the guy in charge of a lighthouse was called the keeper. What people don't know or forget or don't realize is that the life-saving stations were staffed by 6 or 8 guys called surfmen, and one guy in charge called the keeper. So there were keepers of the lighthouses and keepers of the life-saving stations. And one of the analogies I like to make is the difference between the lighthouses and the life-saving service is like the difference between a traffic light and EMS. Traffic lights certainly help not people get killed, but when they do, nothing the traffic light can do. So you need the EMS. So people forget about it. And again, the lighthouses were only operational half of the day. The life-saving service 24/7. Big difference. You're too good to not let you go. So I'll just say, I'll conclude by saying, my name's Keeper James, and I'm a storyteller.